We're here today with Mr. Norb Ryan, who is the statewide coordinator for the Americans with Disabilities Act in Kentucky. Thank you for coming today.
My pleasure.
And let me just start off by asking you to introduce yourself.
Well, you pretty much doing it. I've been involved in the state for about 30 years. I've been the state ADA coordinator for the last almost 8.5 years. Prior to that, I was associated with the Human Development Institute here at the University of Kentucky. And then I was asked if I'd be interested in taking the reins of that office, and I had to at least see what that was all going to be about. So.
Okay, and so is the position that you have, would that be a position that there would be an equivalent or comparable to in other states?
Well, other states, some other states have a statewide ADA coordinator. Some other states have what they call a Governor's Committee on Disabilities. And then those individuals would look after the ADA rights. The situation with that is, I'm not sure how much authority those committees have. They may have to call in the federal government in order to enforce the ADA. I'm lucky here in the state. I have a little more leeway, and I can enforce a lot of the ADA regulations.
Okay. So is your mandate to work with and agencies, public and private, employers, others, to oversee the implementation of the ADA? Or why don't you just tell us about what it is that your office encompasses and what you would do in a typical day?
My office typically is required to oversee the state and make sure that the state government complies with the law, whether it be in employment, facilities, services, or programs, to make sure that all of those are accessible as the law stipulates. Now, my job is to make sure that that happens within the state. I also make my office available to the public, to individuals, to businesses. If they have questions, if they have concerns, they can call my office. I can give them technical assistance. And every now and then, we get involved in cases as well within the public atmosphere. So I've just about covered just about everyone in the state. Last year, my desk alone, I had 253 inquiries about the ADA. Now, a lot of people think those are complaints, and they're not. There are a lot of people just calling and find out what their rights are, or our businesses call and say, I now have a person with a disability. He requires some accommodations. How do I do that? What's appropriate? There are times when me or my staff can help them. There are times when we need to refer them to the Office of Vocational Rehabilitation, Office for the Blind, or some other entity within the state.
Now, I think you were mentioning that you have some enforcement power.
I have some limited enforcement power as far as the state is concerned. As far as a private business, I really don't have the enforcement power, but that's when I team up with Protection and Advocacy or Kentucky Human Rights. That's when I may refer someone to them, and then I work with those entities to go through hopefully a mediation. Once in a while it gets down to we have to go to court. And so that's within the state. I do have some authority to say we're going to do it this way, or this is the appropriate accommodation, and that's what we're going to provide.
When you say the state, does that also incorporate the university systems and educational programs?
I do have some impact on the universities. When I first took over this position, one of the things that I did was I put together a task force on post-secondary education, and that was at that time just the state universities. And what we would do is we would meet 4 times a year to look at ADA issues, to look at things that we might be able to work together on, such as going to the Council for Post-Secondary Education, going to the legislature on various aspects that affect students with disabilities. Now, we've expanded that a little bit, and now we have included the private colleges and universities. So right now, at our last meeting, there were over 35 universities and colleges, both state and private, that were represented.
So, if I can kind of summarize, it sounds like your office answers questions, the people have questions. You make referrals to an appropriate agency. You also provide technical assistance. In some cases, you've got some authority to implement changes.
True.
And you also will work with businesses and employers and individuals to try to mediate any disputes.
That is true.
Okay, got a big job there.
It's a little bit challenging keeping all of that going at one time. I have a rather small staff, but within the state, each cabinet has an ADA person. And so I typically turn over cases from the cabinet to that ADA person. Now, I do have oversight. And if there are some questions, if either party is not happy, then I can become involved and make a ruling about what we're going to do.
Tell us a little bit about, you said you took this position about 8.5 years ago.
Right.
That roughly, not quite, but roughly would be about half the time that the ADA has been implemented, a little bit less.
Sure.
Can you tell us a bit about what you have seen in terms of people's perspectives and attitudes and viewpoints on the ADA? And I know I'm going to ask you also a little bit later about the amendments to the ADA, but if you could just kind of tell us a little bit about what you've seen in terms of changes during that 8.5-year time.
It's kind of difficult because I've seen improvements, but not as much as I would like. I've seen employers become more familiar with it. Some employers embrace it and want to do what they can to help their students with disabilities. Some employers are still looking for the way out, looking for that little phrase that might allow me not to provide the accommodation. But I think we have grown. I think that there's been several programs within the state that were associated with UK, with the Human Development Institute, the Kentucky Business Leadership Network, which reaches out to businesses to help them not only know what the ADA is all about, but also to hire people with disabilities and to take away a lot of that misnomer about what the ADA is all about.
Does your job entail a lot of public speaking to educate employers or service groups or others?
I speak a lot throughout the state, typically somewhere between 50 and 60 times a year. Some of those are individual presentations, one time only. Some of them, like here at UK, I come in and train managers about every 3 months on the 8A and 130. It depends on what I'm requested to do. I also do a lot of training in university settings, to classes and so on, regarding the 8A. One that I do here in UK are for, well, there are already principals who are taking classes to attempt to become superintendents. I go in, talk about the 8A, how it applies to public schools, talk a little bit about employment, so that when they do become principals, they already have that knowledge.
When you work with employers, what do you find would be some of the key concerns or questions that employers have?
Well, the number one concern is the cost. What's this going to cost me? Now, a lot of employers, a lot of individuals, when they think about accommodations, they automatically go to the most expensive, and that's not true. Most accommodations are under $500. There are a lot that don't cost anything, that are just simply rearranging an area or providing access to into a building. So they don't cost that much. So that's what I see. Employers automatically go to, this is going to cost me thousands and thousands of dollars, when that is not necessarily true. So what I do, or what my office attempts to do, is we try to talk with them and find the appropriate accommodations. A lot of employers don't realize that when they do an accommodation, it only needs to be effective for that individual. They have to choose, and they don't have to choose what the doctors may recommend, but they have to choose something that is effective for that individual. And how to work that out. One of the new things that have come out in the last 3 or 4 years, which is quite good, is now we're finding that employers are required to have a dialogue with the employee who is disabled, or the prospective employee. Once they ask for the accommodation, a dialogue needs to take place between the employer and the employee, or the prospective employee, to discuss the accommodation. And a lot of that relieves it. When I have a disability, when I went into the state and they offered me the job, I said, these are the accommodations I will need. I told them what it was. I even told them the cost. I even told them when they could get it on sale. And so, so if that dialogue continues, we can do away with a lot of that fear. And that's part of my training, to make sure that people realize that training must take place, that discussion has to take place. It used to be that an individual would come in with a request for an accommodation, and I would go to their supervisor would send it to the manager would send it to the CEO or whatever, and without even having a discussion, the CEO would say no, and it would come back down, and that's no longer appropriate. And there are court cases now that show that discussion needs to happen in good faith on both sides. The court cases have found, not only for the individual with a disability, but also for the employer, because the individual with the disability did not negotiate in good faith. So everybody's got to play by the rules here.
As I recall, when the ADA first was implemented, and there was a lot of discussion, one of the main kind of approaches or perspectives is that it would be something in which the individual and the employer would negotiate, would communicate, would work together.
That was the original intent of the law. Unfortunately, it didn't work out that way. But now we have court cases where I can show employers, and I can even show people with disabilities, that you have to negotiate in good faith in order to arrive at an appropriate, effective accommodation.
It also, another observation that I have, which I'd like you to comment on, is that after the ADA was implemented, it seemed to have a greater impact in terms of who was benefiting or not benefiting from people already employed rather than people looking to get employed.
I believe you're right. One of the things that we were looking at when I first started here in the UK was just that. People, well, we had two problems. We were trying to help students with disabilities become employed after they graduated. But then the second problem was there were a lot of employers who had good employees that all of a sudden were saying, I have a disability and I can do my job better if I have this accommodation. The other aspect of that was the employers are now calling my office for assistance a lot because now they have an employer and for some reason they become disabled and they don't want to lose that good employee. And so how do I accommodate the new disability so I don't lose all that expertise?
Mm-hmm. Another kind of aspect that I've seen is that in the court cases, you mentioned the court cases, that many of the court cases were really, the ones that came out seemed to be more favorable towards the employer rather than the employee.
Well, one of the problems before the Amendment Act came out was it seemed like the burden was on the employee to prove that he had a disability under the ADA. And that was the focus of the lawsuits. Does this person really qualify? And that's why a lot of the court decisions narrowed who was covered by the ADA. Because a lot of the court decisions at that time, and up until recently, were there to more not to help the individual to get the appropriate accommodation, but to determine whether they were actually covered by the ADA. And a lot of those decisions went against the individual with the disability. And then they found that people that were claiming they were covered by the ADA were not covered by the ADA because of that narrow decision. And they were clearly wrong.
Yeah,
clearly.
Correct me again if I'm wrong. It almost seemed like, when you say covered by the ADA, it almost seemed like that some people were too disabled and some people weren't disabled enough in a way.
Exactly. And some people had disabilities, but then they came up with this mitigating factors. And so if you were on medication that mitigated your disability, you were not disabled. They even had some cases where people had artificial limbs, and because the artificial limb pretty much did away with the disability, they were not covered under the ADA. And it seemed to me that at that time, businesses and the courts were looking for ways to narrow the scope of the ADA as much as they possibly could.
I know that when the ADA was first written, there were a lot of concerns from the business community that it would have a negative effect on business. That would be cost too much, or businesses would lose their flexibility. And I know one of the classic sort of concerns was that the last line on the job description and other duties as assigned, really had to be specified, and businesses were kind of afraid of those types of issues.
Well, businesses were more concerned about how it was going to affect the bottom line. And when you look at it, providing the appropriate accommodations, it does not affect the bottom line. One of the arguments, and I did a radio show several years ago, and a local show, and the host was saying, well, we've got all this litigation, that means they have to pay these lawyers and so on and so forth. And she was bringing up companies like General Motors and so on. And, my take on it is General Motors has attorneys. They're paying them no matter what. So you can't factor that cost into the cost of the accommodation. And one of the things that people really need to realize is one of the basics is that you have to be able to perform the duties of the job. If you're not able to perform the duties of the job with or without accommodations, then you're not qualified. And so a lot of times we have to look at, does the individual have the education? Does he have the experience? Does he have the certificate that everyone else would be required to have that would make him eligible for that position? So there are some guidelines under the ADA that can protect the employer to make sure that they get the best qualified individual.
Okay. And have you seen that occur?
Well, I think that as we got the word out, as I'm doing training, there's a program, like I mentioned before, the Kentucky Business Leadership Network, and they do conferences for businesses at least once a year. And as we get the word out that the employer also has rights, I think it does help. I think it does do away with a lot of their concerns. And also the fact that, accommodations don't have to cost thousands of dollars.
Now, when I look at the impact of the ADA, one of the impacts that I see is that it in a sense, it has made, I'm not certain the right way to say this, but it's made rehabilitation and what we do in rehabilitation more mainstream, more respectable. Not that it wasn't respectable, but it was more than, it was just sort of something in the corner over here, that it's more pervasive throughout and more acceptance throughout the entire our entire society.
Well, I think that when you look at rehabilitation, especially programs like the Office for Vocational Rehabilitation, the Office for the Blind, people are making use of them more and more, and I know that I suggest this quite often when someone's having a problem and they have a disability. Why don't we bring in a specialist from OVR or from the Office for the Blind to look at the situation and to analyze what that job is and to see if there's some way that we can make it better. There have been instances where I've had rehabilitation techs come in where an individual has said, this is what I need, and winds up that they don't need a $3,000 new desk and all of that. They just needed to rearrange the desk so that they can be, so that their disability doesn't affect their job. And so that's a very positive aspect, because once you do that for an employer, he begins to realize that there are other ways to accommodate individuals.
And have you seen people thinking more independently about those types of accommodations and being more open to making those?
Yes, I am, especially when we can go in and look at the situation and say, this is what we think needs to happen. Number one, they not only get the input from the employer and the employee, but they also get the input from a third party that is looking at it objectively and trying to help both the business person and the employee.
In fact, some of it seems to be, smart business practices. Let's say if you have an office and you have a lot of clerical workers, as a preventive measure, just to get ergonomic chairs, ergonomic keyboards, things like that, to prevent back injuries, carpal tunnel, neck strain, those types of things.
And there are a few companies out there that are looking at that, but again, that may take a while to do, because businesses, and they have a right to do this, look at the bottom line. And so they may not be able to do everything at once, but slowly but surely they can do the things that you suggest that may help their employees not only do a better job, but actually want to come into the office.
Yeah, that's right. And I think that people who are satisfied, who enjoy their jobs, who feel appreciated, who feel respected, are less prone to injury.
But again, my point is, they feel like they're needed, they feel that they're contributing, they feel that their employee supports them. They're more likely to be there with the proper attitude.
Right.
And that's a real plus for an employer.
Right. It also seems that when we look at professionals, I know that, we don't use the word handicap anymore. Handicap basically meaning cap in hand begging. But even before the ADA, when that word was out, I noticed that students still kind of had the sense that they were, being welfare workers, that sort of thing. And again, if you could comment on this, one of the changes that I've seen in attitudes is that students look at what they do now as being more valued, as being more respected.
Well, I still have to argue with people who want to use the word handicap. I don't particularly like it because of the law. I use the word disabled all the time. I don't want people to look at anyone with a disability in a charitable, and a kind way to say it, in a charitable way. Part of what I try to get across when I speak with anyone is that people with disabilities have the same wants, needs, and desires of everyone else. People with disabilities want to succeed. They want to have a good life. And in order to do that, they need to be good at their job, and they need to be a benefit to that employer.
Mm-hmm. Another point you were making that I think is an important one to make, and I'd like you to comment on this also, is you were talking about, if we look at the employment provision of the ADA, I think one of the first concepts is that employers have to establish the essential job functions.
Right.
And then the individual has to be able to demonstrate or be able to say, I can do these essential functions.
With or without accommodation.
With or without the accommodation, that's right.
Right.
And I want to make a distinction in a sense, which again I'd like you to comment on. The public rehabilitation counselor can go beyond that in terms of working with employers. In other words, the rehabilitation counselor can go and work with an employer to sculpture a job, which in a sense would be beyond what the ADA requires.
Well, the ADA doesn't really have limits as far as all you have to do is meet the ADA. All right? But then you can go beyond the ADA and, like you said, help the sculptor job or position beyond what is required to make sure that that job or position can get done efficiently and cost effectively. There's no prohibition against that under the ADA. So pretty much it would be up to a rehabilitation individual to be able to make that known to the employer that yes, I can help you to meet the ADA, but maybe we need to look a little wider than that and maybe make this position a little more efficient and comfortable. And you know, but again, that would be up to the individual counselor to be able to present that.
But the ADA was really implemented or devised in order to enable individuals to be able to be self-sufficient and to be empowered and to be able to go and compete for jobs, have a level playing field, be able to have accessibility to buildings, telecommunication services, programs, parks, recreation, and so forth, without the need of a professional having to advocate. I mean, in theory.
Right, the ADA is all about independence, all right, and you're not allowed to do something which may take away the independence from an individual. And I'll give you an example. I had a case, again, it's a big state, where the accessible entrance to a school was not the front door. And what they did was they put a bell, doorbell, so that if somebody wanted to come in that door, they would have to ring the doorbell and someone would have to come and open the door because they had it locked. Well, that was plainly against the ADA. The ADA says that you have the right to go in the door that everybody else does and do it as accessibly as everyone else. All right, if they can just open the door and go in, the person with a disability has that right as well. One of the things that we have been working on throughout the state is voting rights. You know, looking at the making sure that all of the voting locations in the state are accessible, as well as the voting machines, so that people with disabilities can do that without having someone in the booth with them. And we pretty much have done that. We've still got a few that are kind of dragging along, but we're working on them as well. So we'll get that taken care of. So it's all about independence. It's all about allowing people to do the things that they have a right to do. Okay, go to stores, get a job, go shopping, raise a family, and to do that independently, or as independently as possible.
Which, take us up to the current time, if you could, and talk a little bit about the recent amendments to the ADA.
Well, I'm very optimistic about the recent amendments, because what we have done in the past and we have discussed is that the law has been narrowed, all right? And now with the new amendments, the law should broaden up again. In fact, the law says it should be looked at in the broadest possible aspect. So we're in we're in a rather interesting position now where the law passed January 1st of this year, but we still don't have regulations. And I'm anxious looking for the regulations because, once again, Congress let it be known that they were not happy with the regulation that were as written previously. So, and they want it written in a more broader stance, which I applaud. And it's also going to do away with one of the big aspects is we're going to do away with the mitigating effects. So that people that may be on medication, that may, during the job span of 8 hours a day, because of medication, their disability may not be known, they may not need an accommodation now. But the law now says that they will be covered under the law without regard to the mitigating factors, which I applaud. I'll be honest with you, there is a new provision that I'm a little bit concerned about, and that's one of the major life activities is work, and it has always been work. But there were cases that said that in order to meet the ADA, you needed to show that your disability affected other lifetime activities. All right, they have taken that away, and so that's my reading. Okay, so now you can have a disability solely for work, and I'll tell you why that worries me. That worries me because a person who may not be disabled can now go to his job and say, while I'm working, my back hurts. Under the new regulations, will he be covered by the ADA? Because he may have a back problem solely at work, but it may not affect any of his other life activities. That worries me, so I'm kind of hoping that they address that in the new regulations, because I think that might be one of the things that employers fear, that they're going to have to start accommodating disabilities solely for workplace when they may not be disabled anywhere else. So that may be a fear that may be coming up.
Well, I can see something, let's say, like carpal tunnel syndrome, where someone is data entry work, and that may need to be accommodated, but it may not affect the person in a home environment.
Well, and that was the case, though, that made that decision. Case was she had carpal tunnel at work, but when she went home, she gardened, she dusted, she brushed her teeth with that arm. So the court said she's not substantially disabled, so she doesn't qualify under the ADA. I go back and forth on that one myself. I'm always arguing with myself about that situation.
Well, in that situation, the repetitive activity is the one that rises to a level of being the disability. The other activities could be non-repetitive or done at the person's own pace.
Right, and I agree with you. And I think if the regulations come out and make that clear, then we'll be okay. I don't have a problem with that at all. I'm just a little bit concerned that there may be some people out there that may abuse the ADA when they shouldn't, when they aren't really disabled. But we'll see.
We'll see how that.
We'll see how that works.
Well, it's the sort of thing where we're trying to look at you have a square peg and putting it into a round hole. We're trying to, and that goes back to the notion that people should come to the table in good faith.
Right. Correct.
and not, you know, look at the law in a particular or just narrow perspective and blow it up to be everything.
And I think what's going to happen as well is we're going to have another round of lawsuits because people are going to want to press for their rights, or an employer said, I'm not going to provide this. I think we're going to wind up with another round of lawsuits that will define the ADA. Now, what's good about that is that the law now says it has to be interpreted in the broadest possible way. And, you know, so I think the lawsuits will better define, again, what the ADA means.
Mm-hmm. Move away a little bit from the employment aspects of the ADA. Have you seen changes in other areas such as transportation, access to public services, access to buildings, department stores, shopping, those sorts of things, rest areas, recreational facilities?
Well, once again, and this is a constant problem with me, facilities, recreation programs. People build buildings, and they don't always comply with the ADA. Now, I have on my staff a building specialist, and if I get a complaint, I will send that individual out. We will do a survey. We will then send that survey to the owner and say, we need to make these corrections. And we will even give them the law. And we'll show them exactly what the law says here. Unfortunately, buildings are still being built without complying to the ADA. I've had one case where the architect had the ADA correct, but when it came to the contractor, he decided to make some cuts and to save some money. And so all of a sudden, when the individual thought they were getting a compliant building because of the contractor, he was not. So we had to go back and point those out and say, let's go again. We're trying very, very hard to work with buildings that are going up by, well, the most recent would be the administration of the courts. Have just, well, for years now have been building new courthouses. We're in a position now where we're going to start to look at courthouses to make sure that they were built properly. And we're just going to do that. We're not going to do that today we're going to go out and look at the courthouses. But if I have a complaint in a county, then my facility specialist will stop by the courthouse just to make sure it's accessible. Because I think that's important. And I think that's part of my job, is to make sure that those courthouses are accessible. Because that's where you go, well, that's where you go for your automobile license. That's where you go when you're, do just about anything. So that's really important that they be as accessible as possible.
I know the issues locally that I've been involved in at the university, it's not just accessibility, but the level of accessibility that you have. And for one example that I use is if we go from the building we're in now to the building where my office is, Taylor Education Building, it's the building, it's an attractive, it's a nice building, but you can't get into it if you go straight down the hill here to go to the building. You've got to go around to the side, and not only that, there's no sign that tells you to do that. which to me would be the easiest.
Yeah, clear. It's a violation. Except for the courthouses, my office is mandated not to go out looking. Okay, I have to wait for a complaint, and once I get the complaint, then we can take action. And I'm kind of happy about that because we're very busy. We're very busy now, I should say. Well, from now on, if you go anywhere, look at it and do it, we'd be snowed under. I can walk into any building and point out at least a half dozen ADA violations, at least. In fact, my wife won't allow me to do that anymore when we go out. Mm-hmm. She says, you're not working anymore. You want to come back tomorrow and do that, that's fine, but not while we're working, not while we're on our date.
Right. And I certainly can understand that because you don't have to look very hard to find things.
You really don't. You really don't.
Yeah, and even things, even things that aren't accessible. I go, if you go down to the law school here, there are steps there. I mean, there's a ramp and so on, but even the steps are in a zigzag configuration, so that even if you could use the steps and don't need a ramp, it still can present a cognitive sort of problem getting in.
Well, once again, people do things so that they think they look good. They don't think about the actual use of the building. We had a situation with the school where we were at a brand new school. We were asked to go and look at it. Someone filed a complaint, and there was no ramp to the front door. And when we met with the architect and we said, this is a new school, you were supposed to make it accessible, he pointed out that the ramp is around back. But he also pointed out I didn't want to put it in front because it would destroy the ambiance of the entrance. And I said, I don't care about the ambiance. We're going to put in a ramp. So they now have a ramp going in the front door. Otherwise, everything was fine. But he just didn't want to destroy the ambiance.
Of course, with new construction, things can be designed, have universal design that enhances the ambiance of a building.
And I think that more and more architects are becoming aware that if they do it right, if they look at it, they can do it and do it in a way that would be very appealing to people. One of the nice things is, it seems, and I'm sorry I don't have any numbers to share, but it seems that more and more I'm having architects come into my office to make sure that they're complying with the ADA. Unfortunately, we have some that are just not interested. We're going to look at a situation in the state where they put in a walkway and they're not worried about ADA guidelines. And I know right now that it's not ADA compliant. I feel bad for the entity that put it in. They got a special grant to put it in, and they didn't make it ADA compliant. So they're going to have to pretty much redo the whole thing because they didn't bother to ask the architect and say, are you sure that this is ADA compliant?
So even though we've made a lot of progress, we also have situations of people who should know better, don't know better.
Correct. Or if they do know better, they choose to ignore it for this particular project or whatever. And the problem with that is, if I get the complaint, then I'm mandated to go and look at it. And if I look at it and it doesn't comply, then it will comply. And if they say we're not going to, then I arrange for someone to make the complaint to the P&A or Human Rights Commission, and then we're going to wind up suing. So it may take a little bit longer, but slowly but surely we're making corrections. Can I tell you the one group that seriously drives me crazy? Doctors. People who should know better are building buildings that are not accessible.
Really?
And they're working with people with disabilities, but their buildings aren't accessible. I bet you that happens more frequently than any other group.
What accounts for that, would you say? Any thoughts?
Well, again, I think that, I don't think that when people go to put up a building that they're really thinking about people with disability. What bothers me is the architect should have said, we need to make this accessible as well. The doctor should have said, I have patients in wheelchairs, they need to get in the building. Neither one of those two apparently thought about it. And then I get a phone call and they have to rethink it. Now, I have to say, now that I picked on doctors, when we go down and we point out the deficiencies, they are more than happy to make the corrections, and they do make the corrections.
Actually, sometimes the corrections are, in the long run, good business.
No, that is true. That is true.
And it's not just a cliche. I think that from what I've seen, stores that are accessible tend to be not just accessible for people who need the accessibility, but for even others, making it more convenient for them.
They make it easier to shop in those stores. And that's, people tend to go to where they enjoy to shop. And if people go by the ADA regulations, again, we're getting into kind of universal design. It's comfortable for everyone.
Right. Because I know a lot of times a person who doesn't need to use a ramp will use it because it's easier than the stairs.
Well, and the automatic doors. I can't tell you how many times I look at the building that I'm in, and I can sit outside and watch people use the automatic door because they're carrying they're carrying some briefcases, or they have their little travel kits behind them, and those automatic doors just make it a lot easier to get into the building. When you talk about curb ramps, not only does it make things accessible for people with disabilities, but for mothers who have children or are using carriages, they can use the ramps as well. So it does benefit everyone. Right. And that's one of my selling points, It's not only for people with disabilities, but there are others that are going to be able to use it as well.
Well, we're almost out of time now. It's almost been an hour that we've been talking, and our tapes will last about an hour, just to tell you a little bit about the technical aspects of things. Before we wrap up, are there other final thoughts that you have, or other comments you'd like to make, and things that you thought of as we've been talking?
Well, there's one or two. I'm excited about the ADA Amendment Act because I think it will broaden the ADA and provide a lot more protection for a lot more individuals. The other aspect that maybe we need to point out real quick is people with disabilities don't really have an understanding of what the ADA encompasses. And a lot of times they think it encompasses things that it doesn't. It gives them rights that they don't have. And there's a lot of times when I have to talk to people and say, well, the ADA doesn't apply here, and you don't have the right to do that because of the ADA. And so I wish that more people with disabilities would become more familiar with the ADA and what their rights are under the ADA, and not try to expand it beyond what it's meant to be, because that can cause some problems and anxieties with employers and store owners and so on. So those are my last two.
Well, and I think that's certainly part of what you do is providing technical assistance.
Right.
Is to work with employers, businesses, and with consumers, individuals, to know what the rights and responsibilities are.
Exactly.
Right. And that's always a balancing act also.
Well, one of the things that I hear a lot from people with disabilities, and I just had this yesterday. They accuse me of not being an advocate for them individually. What I try to impress upon people is I'm an advocate for the law. And at times the law will benefit the person with the disabilities. It could also benefit the employer or the business owner as well.
Right.
And so I have to look at things according to the law.
Right, and that's a balancing act.
Yes,
and you're not going to make people happy all the time.
No, I'm not.
So,
no, I'm not.
But thank you for sharing your knowledge and your insights and your perspective. It was very enlightening and very beneficial.
My pleasure.
And I appreciate you coming by today to do that.
My pleasure.
Okay, and thank you.
Thank you.